The moment Albert Sullivan rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, he knew he was done with the life that had brought him there. His horse, a broad-chested roan named Copper, was lathered from 3 days of hard riding, and Albert himself was not much better, trail dust caked into the creases of his face, a bruise yellowing along his jaw from a fistfight in Wichita that he had not entirely started but had certainly finished. He was 27 years old, lean as whipcord, with dark eyes that had seen enough to make a man considerably older and considerably quieter. He had ridden for 3 different cattle outfits, served briefly as a deputy marshal in a town in Texas that no longer existed, and had, on 3 separate occasions, drawn his revolver against other men and fired it. Each of those men had lived, which Albert considered something between a mercy and a miracle. But the 4th man had not lived, and that was the one Albert could not shake loose from his conscience, no matter how many miles he put between himself and the place it happened. He did not intend to stay in Caldwell. He had a letter from a cousin in Colorado Territory, describing work on a cattle ranch near Pueblo, and the plan had been to ride straight through and not stop anywhere long enough to grow roots. But Copper threw a shoe just south of town, and the blacksmith's shop was closed until morning, and the only reasonable thing to do was stable the horse and find a room for the night. The hotel was called the Drover's Rest, which was exactly what it sounded like, a 2-story clapboard building painted a faded yellow that might once have been cheerful and was now simply weathered. Albert paid for a room, left his saddlebags on the bed, and went downstairs to find something to eat. The dining room of the Drover's Rest was small and warm, smelling of wood smoke and roasting meat, and it was nearly full at that hour of evening. Albert took the last open table near the window and removed his hat, running a hand through dark hair that badly needed cutting. He was reading the handwritten menu board on the wall when he heard a voice that stopped him cold. "If you are planning on ordering the venison stew, I would advise against it. Mrs. Henley made it this morning with yesterday's stock, and she is in a disagreement with the butcher, so the meat is not what it should be. The roasted chicken, however, is excellent." He turned. She was standing at the table beside his, delivering plates to a pair of cattle buyers who looked enormously pleased by her attention. She was perhaps 24, with auburn hair pinned up in a practical style that still managed to look elegant, and dark brown eyes that were sharp with intelligence and warm with the particular kind of humor that belongs to people who work very hard and choose to make the best of it. She wore a simple cotton dress of deep blue, an apron over it, and boots that suggested she had grown up somewhere with more mud than parlors. Albert ordered the roasted chicken. She brought it herself, setting the plate down with the easy efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years. "Thank you," Albert said, and then, because he could not help himself, "You always advise strangers on what to eat." She looked at him then, a proper look, assessing. "Only the ones who look like they have not had a decent meal in some time. You look like you have been riding hard." 3 days, he said. "Where from?" "Wichita." She gave him a small nod, the kind that acknowledged the answer without encouraging a longer conversation, and turned to go. "What is your name?" he asked, not because he had planned to, but because it seemed suddenly very important that he know it. She paused, and he saw the slight tightening at the corners of her mouth that was not quite a smile and not quite a refusal. "Henrietta Fairchild," she said. "And yours?" "Albert Sullivan." "Well, Mr. Sullivan," she said, "enjoy your chicken. I hope it is better than whatever you have been eating for 3 days." It was considerably better. But Albert barely tasted it, because he spent the better part of the meal watching Henrietta Fairchild move through that small dining room with a grace and a quiet authority that he found impossible to look away from. He extended his stay in Caldwell by 1 additional day, telling himself it was because Copper needed rest after the farrier's work. This was not entirely untrue, but it was also not the entire truth. On the second evening, he returned to the Drover's Rest dining room and found Henrietta there again, and they spoke a little longer this time, about the town, about the cattle drives that were the lifeblood of Caldwell in those years, about the weather, which had been unpredictable that spring. He learned that she had come to Caldwell 2 years earlier from a small town in Missouri, that she was supporting herself entirely on her own wages, and that she had a practical and somewhat unapologetic view of the world that he found both refreshing and slightly terrifying. On the third morning, he was packed and ready to leave when she came through the lobby carrying a basket of bread to the kitchen and stopped short at the sight of him standing at the desk with his saddlebags over his shoulder. "Heading out," she said, and her voice was perfectly neutral, which was not the same as indifferent. "Heading to Colorado," he said. "Cattle work near Pueblo," she nodded. "That is good work, I hear." "Henrietta," he said, and the use of her first name surprised them both slightly. "May I write to you?" She studied him for a long moment. There was something careful in her expression, something that went beyond the ordinary consideration a woman gives to such a question. "Mr. Sullivan," she said slowly, "I have seen enough of the kind of men who come through cattle towns to know the difference between the ones passing through and the ones who are running from something. You are the second kind." He did not flinch from that because it was true. "I am," he said, "but I am trying to be something different. I would like the chance to show that." She was quiet for several seconds. Then she said, "You may write to me. I make no promises about what I will write back." He left Caldwell that morning riding a little taller in the saddle than he had arrived. He wrote her from a cattle camp outside Trinidad in late April, a letter that began formally and then, somewhere in the second paragraph, stopped being formal entirely and became something genuine. He told her about the country, the way the Rockies looked at dawn, the sound the wind made coming off the plains, the particular loneliness of open land that was also, in its way, a kind of freedom. He told her about a dog at the ranch that had taken to following him everywhere and whom he had named Pilgrim because they were both, he felt, still figuring out where they belonged. She wrote back. Her letter was shorter than his, precise and measured, but it was not cold. She described Caldwell in April, the dust and the commerce, and the way the cattle buyers talked amongst themselves in the hotel lobby, as though the walls were made of paper, which they largely were. She described a disagreement between two neighboring shopkeepers that had been running for 3 months and showed no sign of resolution. She described the color of the sky on a particular evening that she thought he might appreciate, having ridden from that direction. At the end, she wrote, "I am not sure what I make of you, Mr. Sullivan, but I find that I am curious, which is more than I usually am." He read that last line 4 times. He rode down to Pueblo the following week and found the work steady and the foreman fair, a man named Clarence Webb who ran his outfit with old-fashioned efficiency and expected his hands to earn their pay without drama. Albert earned his pay. He was good with cattle and better with horses, and he had the kind of quiet competence that made a man useful without making him conspicuous. He stayed out of the saloon arguments that ended in bruises and occasionally in knives, drank moderately, and spent his evenings writing long letters to a woman in Caldwell, Kansas, who wrote back with careful, measured honesty and the occasional dry observation that made him laugh out loud in the bunkhouse to the mild confusion of his companions. By June, he was addressing her as Henrietta without ceremony. By July, she had begun her letters with Dear Albert, a change so small it might have meant nothing and yet meant everything. By August, the letters were arriving and departing twice a week, and Albert had begun to understand that he was in very serious trouble of the best possible kind. It was in August that he told her about the man in Texas. He had not planned to. He had been writing about something else entirely. A storm that had come off the mountains with unusual violence, the way the lightning had struck a cottonwood 100 yards from the bunkhouse and split it down the middle. And then somehow, without quite knowing how he got there, he was telling her about a town called Bitter Creek and a man named Calhoun Roper, and the night that had ended with a gunshot and a silence that Albert could not fill. Calhoun Roper had been a cattle thief, and a cruel one, the kind of man who enjoyed the damage he caused. Albert had been riding as a deputy marshal at the time, barely 25 years old, carrying a badge that he had earned on the strength of his reputation with a firearm and a recommendation from a marshal in Abilene. Roper had shot first into a dark alley, and Albert had fired back by instinct and reflex, the way a man does when his body acts before his mind catches up. Roper had died before morning. And Albert had stood over him in that alley and felt something hollow where the righteousness was supposed to be. He had pinned the badge on the sheriff's desk the following morning and ridden out before noon. He wrote all of this to Henrietta in August of 1878 from a cattle camp in Colorado by the light of a lantern that needed trimming, and when he sealed the letter he sat with it in his hands for a long time before putting it in the mail bag. Her reply came 12 days later. He opened it with hands that were not entirely steady. She wrote, "I believe you when you say it was not murder. I believe that you have carried it as though it were, which tells me something about the kind of man you are. But I must be honest with you, Albert, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort. I lost my father to a man with a gun. Not a deputy, not anyone acting with any authority or reason. Simply a man who decided one evening that my father was in his way. My father was a gentleman who never raised his hand to anyone, and he was buried in the spring of 1874 when I was 20 years old, and my mother was still young enough to have lived for 30 more years if grief had not taken her 2 years after that. I tell you this not to accuse you or to compare you to the man who killed him, because I do not think you are that kind of man. I tell you this because I need you to understand that when I look at a man who has blood on his hands, even blood that came from necessity or law or accident, I feel something that I cannot simply reason away. I am being honest with you. I hope you will be patient with me while I am honest." Albert read that letter standing at the fence post where the mail had been delivered in the morning light with the mountains behind him, and he felt the full weight of what she was saying settle into him like water into dry ground. He wrote back immediately. He said, "I am patient. I am not going anywhere." He meant it. He also, in the quiet of the following days, began to think seriously about what it might mean to wash his hands of the life that had gotten them stained in the first place. Not the honest work, the cattle, the horses, the long riding days that he was genuinely good at and genuinely fond of. But the other thing, the willingness to put himself in situations where violence was a likely outcome, the instinct to reach for the revolver that he had cultivated over years of necessary living in places where that instinct kept you alive. He thought about what it would mean to lay that down deliberately, not because someone was making him, but because he chose to. He thought about a woman in Kansas who was worth becoming a better man for. In September, he wrote to his cousin in Colorado Territory and arranged to take a few days away from the ranch, and he rode back to Caldwell. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with his hat pressed and his coat brushed and copper freshly groomed, feeling approximately as nervous as he had ever felt in his life, which was saying something considerable for a man who had faced down armed cattle thieves. He walked into the Drover's Rest at mid-morning, when the dining room was between meals and nearly empty, and he found Henrietta at a table near the window doing the weekly accounts with a concentration that was absolute until he came through the door. She looked up, and for one perfect moment, before she arranged her expression into something more composed, he saw on her face an emotion that was warm and startled and very much glad. "Albert," she said, and it was the first time she had said his name aloud in his presence. It sounded different from the letters, better. "I was in the area," he said, which was so obviously not true. Caldwell was a 2-day ride from Pueblo that she laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, and the sound of it did something irreversible to Albert Sullivan's chest. They spent the morning talking, then the afternoon. Mrs. Henley, the proprietress of the Drover's Rest, was a practical woman of 50 with a tolerant view of human nature, and she found them still at that table when she came to prepare for the evening service, and gave them a look that was amused rather than pointed before suggesting they might want to move their conversation to the porch if they intended to continue it indefinitely. They moved to the porch. The evening came on slowly, the way Kansas evenings do in September, the sky going from blue to amber to the most extraordinary shade of rose, and they sat in the two rocking chairs that occupied the porch of the Drover's Rest and talked about everything and nothing, and the specific important things that you can only really talk about in person. Albert told her more about Texas, more than the letter had contained. About what it was like to be 25 years old in a lawless place with a badge and a gun, and the constant awareness that the difference between law and chaos was a single bad decision made in the dark. About how he had thought at the time that carrying the badge made it clean, that authority sanctioned the violence and therefore the violence was justified. About how he had discovered, in the silence after the gunshot, that sanctioned and clean were not the same thing. Henrietta listened with the full quality of attention that was her particular gift. She did not interrupt. She did not offer reassurance before he had finished. When he was done, she was quiet for several seconds, looking out at the street where the lamplighter was making his evening rounds. "I appreciate that you told me all of it," she said. "Not just the parts that made you look better." "I did not want to look better to you on false grounds," he said. "I would rather look like what I am and have you decide on that." She turned to look at him then directly, the way she had on the first evening when she had been assessing him. "And what are you, Albert Sullivan? A man who has made some mistakes and is trying to make fewer of them going forward," he said. "A man who would very much like to be worthy of your good opinion. And a man who," he paused, and decided to say it plainly because anything less would be cowardice, "is more than a little in love with you, Henrietta, and has been since approximately the second day of knowing you." The porch was very quiet. The lamplighter moved off down the street. Somewhere a door closed. Henrietta looked at him for a long time. There was something in her face that was almost pain, which was not what he had hoped for but was honest, and he had asked for her honesty. "Albert," she said quietly, "I think very highly of you, more highly than I have thought of any man in a very long time, possibly ever. But I need you to hear me when I say this because I mean it from the truest part of myself." She paused. "I cannot love a man with blood on his hands. I know that sounds cold and perhaps unfair given the circumstances of your life, but I have lived with what a bullet can do to a family, and I cannot put my heart in the hands of someone who belongs to that world." The words landed the way she had probably known they would, with precision and weight. Albert absorbed them without flinching because she deserved better than to watch him flinch. "I hear you," he said. "I do." "I am not saying never," she said, and her voice was softer now, almost pained with its own honesty. "I am saying not yet, not while you are still the man who carries that." He nodded slowly. "Then I will not carry it." She looked at him. "Albert." "Not as a promise to you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Not as a bargain or a transaction. But I have been thinking about it for some time now, since your letter in August, and hearing you say it out loud only confirms what I had already been thinking on my own. I am done with the revolver as a way of living. I intend to prove that, not to you, not to anyone in particular, but I intend to prove it by living it, and when it has been proved, I will come back and I will ask you again, and until then I will wait." Henrietta was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, something between admiration and something more complicated and tender. "You would wait," she said, as though the concept was both foreign and deeply affecting. "I have nowhere better to be," he said, simply and entirely sincerely. She was quiet for a while after that, and he let her be quiet, and the evening settled around them in its warm September way. "I have nowhere better to be either," she said finally, very quietly. "I just need you to understand that I am not ready to trust it yet." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to trust it yet. I am asking you to let me show you that it is worth trusting." She looked at him then with that direct, assessing gaze, and something in it was different from before opened up. The way a door opens a crack when someone knocks with the right kind of patience. "Keep writing to me," she said. "Every week," he said. He rode back to Colorado the following morning with Copper moving easily under him, and the sense that something enormous had shifted in the landscape of his future, the way mountains look different depending on which direction you are moving toward them. He kept writing, every week without fail, through the autumn of 1878 and into the cold of that winter. He told her about the ranch, about the work, about Clarence Webb, who had turned out to be something of a genuine mentor in addition to being a fair employer. He told her about Pilgrim the dog, who had by now grown enormous and developed strong opinions about the arrangement of bedrolls in the bunkhouse. He told her about the other hands, a rotating company of men with histories as varied as the terrain, a former schoolteacher from Ohio who had come west after his wife left him, a young man from Georgia who was trying to put the war's aftermath behind him, a Mexican vaquero named Ernesto who could do things with a lasso that Albert considered something close to art. He told her about the first time in years that he had been in a situation where violence was a possible outcome, a drunk man at a supply store in Trinidad who was making threats and had a knife, and how he had talked the man down without reaching for his holster. He described it matter-of-factly, not as a performance of virtue, but as something he wanted her to know had happened, the way you share things with a person whose understanding of you matters. Her letters became longer through that winter. She told him more about Missouri, about her mother and father, about the particular quality of grief that comes when both your parents are gone before you are 22. She told him about why she had left for Kansas, not running, she said, but choosing, which was different, because staying would have meant becoming something smaller than she intended to be. She told him about a woman in Caldwell named Dorothy Marsh, who was a seamstress and had become Henrietta's closest friend, and about Mrs. Henley, who was more generous than her brusque exterior suggested, and about the way the cattle town filled up in the driving season and emptied out in winter until it felt like an entirely different place. She told him in January that she had thought about their conversation on the porch and that she wanted him to know that she believed him. Not about everything, because trust of that completeness took time and living, but she believed his intentions, and she believed that he was genuinely trying to change the shape of his life, and that belief was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a great deal. Albert read that letter sitting on an upturned water trough in the cold Colorado morning and felt something expand in his chest like the first warm day after a long winter. In the spring of 1879, Clarence Webb offered him the position of ranch foreman. It was a significant step, more responsibility, more pay, more permanence. Albert accepted it without hesitation, and then sat down that evening and wrote the longest letter he had yet sent to Henrietta Fairchild, telling her everything about the offer and what it meant and what he was beginning to understand about the kind of life he actually wanted to build. He did not ask her anything in that letter. He was patient. He had promised her patience, and he meant to keep that promise. But she asked him something in her reply. She said, "Albert, would you consider visiting Caldwell again in June? Dorothy is to be married, and I think I would like very much to see a friendly face from outside the ordinary." He was in Caldwell by the 1st of June, with 2 weeks given to him, by a very knowing Clarence Webb who had, by this point, heard enough about a woman in Kansas to form some fairly accurate opinions about where his foreman's heart was located. The wedding of Dorothy Marsh, soon to be Dorothy Alcott, wife of a schoolteacher named George Alcott who had arrived in Caldwell in the fall and had apparently wasted no time, was a cheerful affair held in the small Methodist church on a Saturday afternoon, with the whole town seeming to have turned out. Albert sat beside Henrietta in the pew and was very much aware of the exact distance between their shoulders, which was less than it had been on the porch the previous September. Afterward, at the celebration in the churchyard, They walked together along the edge of the gathering in the particular companionable way of two people who have been corresponding for nearly a year and find, to their relief and delight, that the person on the paper is the same as the person in front of them. "You look well," she said. "Foreman suits you." "You look," he began, and then could not find the word that was sufficient. "You look like yourself," he said, "which is the best thing I know how to say." She smiled at that, a full smile, the kind she did not give away casually, and Albert thought, not for the first time, that he would ride any number of days across any number of plains to see that smile. They danced. The celebration had a fiddle player, an older man named Hutchins, who played with more enthusiasm than technical precision, but made up for it entirely in joy. And when the dancing started, Albert offered Henrietta his hand and she took it, and they danced a reel in the churchyard grass in the Kansas afternoon sunlight. And Albert was aware with extraordinary clarity that he was as happy as he had ever been. Later, when the celebrating had moved inside the church hall and they had drifted back onto the steps in the evening air, Henrietta said something that he had not expected. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Something I have been working up to for some time." He waited. "When you left last September and said you would wait," she said carefully, "I thought it was something men say, a thing that sounds meaningful and fades in the actual living. I thought you would write for a few months and then the letters would become less frequent and then they would stop, and that would be the truth of it." She looked at him steadily. "I was wrong about that." "You were," he agreed gently. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the difference between what I said I needed and what I am actually feeling. And I think," she paused, and he could see her choosing her words with the precision she brought to everything, "I think that what I needed was to know that you were choosing a different kind of life because you believed it was the right way to live, not because you were trying to win something. And I think that is what you have been doing. And I am," another pause, longer this time, "I am finding that the thing I said I could not do is considerably harder not to do than I anticipated." Albert Sullivan, who had faced armed men in dark alleys and driven cattle through mountain passes and ridden 3 days without stopping, felt suddenly that this was the bravest conversation he had ever been part of. "Henrietta," he said, "I'm not going to rush you. I just need you to know that what I feel for you is not something I have ever felt before, and it is not something I expect to feel again if you send me away. I am not saying that to put pressure on you. I am saying it because I think you deserve to know the full truth of where I am standing." She looked at him for a long moment, the evening light on her face, the sounds of celebration drifting from inside the church hall. "I know," she said softly. "I know exactly where you are standing. That is rather the whole difficulty." He laughed, low and warm, and she laughed too, and they stood together on the church steps in that June evening in Caldwell, Kansas, with the fiddle music seeping through the walls, and something between them settled into place like a key turning in a lock. He stayed in Caldwell for his full 2 weeks. Every day was different from the last. They walked along the cattle pens in the morning when the work was quiet and the air still cool, talking about everything. They rode out one afternoon to the open plain south of town, just the two of them on horseback, with Henrietta on a sturdy bay mare borrowed from the livery stable, and she turned out to ride very well indeed, which Albert found he had expected without realizing it. They had supper together at the hotel table where they had first spoken, and it was nothing like that first meal. It was easier and warmer and full of the kind of laughter that comes from knowing someone well enough to be surprised by them still. On the last evening before he rode back to Colorado, Albert bought 2 cups of coffee from the hotel kitchen and brought them to the porch, and they sat again in the rocking chairs, and he said nothing that required an answer because sometimes the most important things can be said in silence. Before he left the next morning, Henrietta walked with him to the livery stable where Copper was waiting, and she said quietly, "Come back in the fall." "I will be here before the leaves change," he said. She reached out and adjusted the collar of his coat in the straightforward way she had, purely practical, no pretense. And then, With a precision that was entirely characteristic, she looked directly at him and said, "I am beginning to think, Albert Sullivan, that you might be worth the risk." It was perhaps the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to him. He rode back to Colorado with Pilgrim trotting alongside Copper for the first mile before turning back toward the ranch, and Albert grinned into the Kansas wind like a young fool, and he did not care one bit. The summer of 1879 was not without difficulty. In July, a man came through the Pueblo area looking for ranch hands willing to take on a contract involving the movement of cattle that was, under examination, not entirely above board. Several of the hands considered it. The money was good, and some of them had no strong feelings about where the cattle had come from. Albert had a direct conversation with the man at the gate of the Webb Ranch and told him to ride on, and the man did, muttering unpleasantly, and nothing came of it. Clarence Webb shook Albert's hand the following morning without a word, which was the Webb equivalent of a medal. Albert wrote to Henrietta about it in his weekly letter, matter-of-factly, the way he always wrote about these things, as evidence of a pattern he was building, not as a claim for approval. Her reply came with unusual speed. "I have been thinking about something, and I am going to ask you plainly, because I have decided that plain is the only way I know how to say it. Would you consider coming to Caldwell in September not for a visit but to stay? The hotel has been talking about bringing on a stable manager, and there is other work in town, and I am aware that I have been asking you to wait and you have been waiting, and I think it is time that I stop making you wait on one side of this and start being honest about what I actually want." Albert read the letter 3 times on a hot July afternoon in the barn. Then he walked into the ranch house and told Clarence Webb that he was going to need to find a new foreman. Clarence Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is this the woman in Kansas?" "Yes, sir," Albert said. "Well," said Webb, "you have been the best foreman this ranch has had in 15 years, and I am sorry to lose you, and I hope she deserves it." "She does," Albert said. "And then some." He arrived in Caldwell in August rather than September, a full month early, because he had finished his obligations at the Webb Ranch efficiently and because, if he was honest, he could not wait the extra month. He rode into town on a hot August morning with his gear packed and Pilgrim trotting alongside, and the sense that everything ahead of him was new in the best possible way. Henrietta was on the porch of the Drover's Rest when he arrived, as though she had known exactly when he would appear, which, knowing Henrietta, he did not entirely discount. She stood when she saw him, and her face did the thing it had done in June when he first arrived, that moment of warm, startled gladness before composure reasserted itself. But this time the composure did not fully reassert itself. This time the warmth stayed. "You are early," she said. "I am," he said, swinging down from Copper. "I finished sooner than expected." "And Pilgrim," she said, looking at the enormous dog who was regarding her with dignified interest. "You brought Pilgrim." "He does not travel well when left behind," Albert said. "I hope that is all right." Henrietta looked at Pilgrim for a moment. Then she knelt down in her good dress on the porch boards and held out her hand, and Pilgrim stepped forward and pressed his large head against her palm, and Henrietta looked up at Albert with an expression so unguarded and warm that he had to look away for a moment to collect himself. "It is more than all right," she said. He found a room in a boarding house on Merchant Street and applied for the stable manager position, which he got without difficulty. The owner of the main livery stable, a widower named Gerald Hoskins, was looking to step back from the physical work and knew horses well enough to recognize that Albert knew them better. The work suited him exactly. He was outdoors, he was with animals, he was using skill he had spent his whole life building, and at the end of every day he walked back toward the Drover's Rest where Henrietta was finishing her evening service, and they ate supper together in the kitchen after the dining room closed, just the two of them at the small table by the stove. It was in those kitchen suppers that he learned her most completely. The way she was decisive about almost everything and openly uncertain about almost nothing, except the things that truly mattered, where she was thoughtful and honest about her uncertainty in a way that he found deeply admirable. The way she laughed, not easily but genuinely, and all the more valuable for it. The way she talked about her parents, with a love and grief that was 7 years old but still fresh in certain lights, and the way she never romanticized them into more than they were, just loved them for exactly what they had been. She met Pilgrim properly in those weeks, and Pilgrim, who was discriminating in his affections, decided within the first several days that Henrietta Fairchild was his second person, and took to sitting outside the Drovers' Rest in the evenings waiting for her to come out, which she seemed to find both absurd and deeply touching. One evening in late September, sitting in the kitchen after supper with the lamplight low and the sounds of the town settling into night, Henrietta said suddenly, "I owe you something." He looked up from his coffee. "What is that?" "An apology," she said, or more precisely, a correction. She was looking at the table and then she looked up at him. "When I said what I said about blood on your hands, I meant it, and I still mean the feeling of it. But I said it in a way that made it about what you had done, and I have come to understand over this past year that it was more about my own fear, about the thing I was afraid of, which was letting myself care for someone who lived close to that kind of danger. Because my father did not live close to danger. He was simply in the wrong place, and it made no difference. He was gone just the same. So the fear is not rational, and it is not entirely about you. I needed you to know that." Albert was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I knew it was about your father," he said. "You did not need to explain that." "I know you knew," she said, "but I needed to say it out loud, to you, because it seemed important to say it from the right side of the table instead of the letters." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the first time he had done that, a deliberate crossing of a threshold, and she looked at his hand on hers, and she did not move away. "Henrietta," he said, "there is nothing you could tell me about your fear that would make me think less of you. You lost your parents to grief and violence before you were 25. You came to a cattle town alone and built a life entirely on your own. The fact that you were also afraid of being hurt again is not a failing. It is just being human." She turned her hand under his so that their fingers were interleaved, and she held on with the particular grip of someone who has made a decision. "I have been in love with you for some time," she said, quietly and plainly and entirely in the voice she used for true things. "I have been in love with you and too frightened to say it, and I think that is long enough to have been frightened." Albert Sullivan, who had been patient for a year and 2 months, felt the whole year's worth of waiting resolve into something so clean and warm it was almost physical. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since the evening on the porch in September when you told me you could not love a man with blood on his hands, which is possibly not the usual moment a man falls in love, but there it is." She looked at him with that expression that was simultaneously amused and deeply serious and entirely Henrietta, and she said, "I believe that is approximately when I started to love you as well." He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in October, on the open plain south of Caldwell where they had ridden together in June, with the autumn grass turned gold, and the sky that particular deep blue of the Kansas fall, and Pilgrim sitting nearby with the dignified air of a witness, who considers himself somewhat integral to the proceedings. He had a ring, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that he had found in a jeweler's shop in Trinidad the previous spring, when he had not been sure enough of anything to buy it but had been unable to stop thinking about it. He had been carrying it for 6 months. Henrietta looked at the ring in his open palm for a long moment, and then she looked at him, and her eyes were bright with something that in any other woman he might have called tears, but in Henrietta was simply emotion too large to be contained by composure. "Yes," she said, the single word clear and certain, without any qualification at all. He put the ring on her finger, and she kissed him for the first time there on the open plain with the autumn wind and Pilgrim pretending to look the other way. And it was exactly what he had understood it would be, the best thing that had ever happened to him, bar none. in a life that had contained quite a lot of things. They were married in the Caldwell Methodist Church in November of 1879. Mrs. Henley closed the hotel for the afternoon and attended in her best hat. Gerald Hoskins stood as Albert's witness. Dorothy Alcott, née Marsh, stood as Henrietta's, her new husband George beside her beaming with the enthusiasm of a man who is very glad to see other people as happy as he is. Clarence Webb sent a letter and a crate of the finest whiskey available in Colorado Territory. The ceremony was brief and exactly right. The minister asked his questions and they answered them plainly, looking at each other, and when he was pronounced her husband and she his wife, there was a moment of perfect stillness in that small church that felt, to Albert, like the stillness after a storm passes, when everything is washed clean and the air smells new. They dined that evening at a long table in the Drover's Rest, the whole small company of people who had come to witness the day, and the conversation was warm and full of the particular joy that comes when good things happen to people who have waited for them honestly. Late that night, after the guests had gone and the town had quieted into its night rhythms, Albert and Henrietta sat on the porch of the boarding house where they were staying until their own arrangements could be settled, and he looked at his wife in the moonlight and felt something vast and solid settle in him, like a man who has been riding for a very long time coming at last to the place he was riding toward. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am going to enjoy being married to you," he said. "I expect it will be somewhat complicated," she said. "I have a strong personality. I am aware," he said. "It is one of the things I love most." She leaned against his shoulder, which was not a small gesture for Henrietta Fairchild, who had been entirely self-sufficient for a very long time, and he put his arm around her with the confidence of a man who knows exactly where he is and exactly what he is doing. The winter of 1879 and into 1880 was the settling-in time. They found a small house at the edge of Caldwell's residential streets, a practical place with a porch and a kitchen garden, and a barn large enough for 2 horses and Pilgrim's increasingly proprietary presence. Albert continued his work at the livery stable, which Gerald Hoskins had come to rely on him for so thoroughly that the old man had taken to calling himself retired in all but name. Henrietta continued at the Drover's Rest, though she was working fewer hours now, gradually reducing her position as they established their household. She was happy. He watched her be happy with a kind of wondering attention that he suspected would never entirely wear off. She was not a woman who expressed contentment in obvious ways. She was not effusive or demonstrative by nature, but it showed in the particular quality of her attention when she was at home, the way she moved through the rooms of their small house with a proprietary ease, the way she argued with him over dinner about subjects ranging from the cattle market to the quality of Mrs. Henley's new bread recipe, to the question of whether Pilgrim should be allowed on the furniture. A battle that Pilgrim was unambiguously winning. She argued with him honestly on the merits, and expected him to argue back the same way, and he did, and they disagreed about a number of things and agreed about more, and the disagreements were never the kind that left damage. He watched her with Pilgrim and thought that if he had needed any confirmation that his choice had been exactly right, the sight of Henrietta Fairchild sitting on the porch in the evening light with one hand resting on the head of a large dog who adored her would have provided it entirely. In the spring of 1880, Gerald Hoskins told Albert he was thinking of selling the livery stable and that he hoped Albert would consider taking on the purchase. It was a significant undertaking. The stable was the primary establishment of its kind in Caldwell, and with the cattle drive still running strong through the town, it was profitable work. Albert talked it over with Henrietta for 3 evenings at the kitchen table, going through the finances with the thoroughness she brought to everything numerical. "It is a good investment," she said on the 3rd evening, with the calm certainty of someone who has examined the numbers enough times to trust them. "And it suits you. And it means you are not working for someone else's enterprise, which I think matters to you more than you say." "It does," he admitted. "Then we should do it," she said, and that was that. They bought the livery stable in May of 1880. The day the papers were signed, Albert stood in the center of the stable he now owned and felt something he had not expected, not pride exactly, though that was part of it, but a deeper, quieter satisfaction, the kind that comes from arriving somewhere you chose rather than somewhere you ended up. He had been a man with a gun and a restless horizon for most of his adult life, and now he was a man with a wife and a dog and a livery stable in Caldwell, Kansas. And the horizon was still there, but it was a comfortable one, a known one, and he found he did not miss the other kind at all. The summer of 1880 brought the news that Henrietta was expecting a child. She told him on a July morning in the kitchen, in her direct way, with the same matter-of-fact quality she brought to everything, but her eyes gave her away shining with something that was entirely beyond composure. Albert sat down in the kitchen chair because his legs made the decision before his mind caught up, and then he stood up again, and then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her carefully as though she might be fragile, and she laughed against his shoulder and said, "I am not made of glass." "I know," he said. "I know you are not." He held her a bit tighter. "Henrietta, we are going to have a child." "Apparently so," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, which he found enormously moving in a woman who was almost never not entirely steady. Pilgrim, sensing the significance of something, pressed himself against both their legs in solidarity. The child was born in February of 1881, on a cold morning with snow falling on the Kansas plain and a fire built high in the bedroom grate. Mrs. Henley served as practical assistance. She had a background in such things, and Henrietta trusted her. Dorothy Alcott was there as well, and Albert was on the other side of the bedroom door for approximately the longest 3 hours of his life, listening and being entirely useless, which he found very difficult. The child was a boy. He was brought into the world at approximately 7 in the morning, while the snow was still falling, and he came in loudly, with a voice that immediately suggested he would have opinions. Albert was brought in to see him shortly thereafter, and he sat on the edge of the bed where Henrietta lay with the baby against her chest, and he looked at the small, red, furious face of his son, and he felt something that he had no previous reference point for, a love so sudden and absolute that it was almost like a physical blow, the same quality of irreversibility as the moment he had first seen Henrietta's face, but entirely its own thing, new and different. "He looks angry," he said, because the baby did look somewhat put out by the whole business. "He looks healthy," Henrietta said, with the weary precision of a woman who has just done something very hard. "That is the relevant thing." "He does look healthy," Albert agreed. "What shall we call him?" Henrietta had been thinking about names since November with the systematic thoroughness she brought to decisions. They had discussed several. She looked at the baby now and said, "Thomas, I would like to call him Thomas." "Thomas," Albert tried it. The baby, who was settling now, seemed unbothered by the name. "After your father. My father's middle name was Thomas," she said. "Yes, Thomas Sullivan," Albert said. "That is a good name for a good boy." She looked up at him then with the candid warmth that she had gradually allowed herself over these past 2 years, the kind that she had kept held back for such a long time, and that was, now that it was given freely, one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" he asked. "For being patient," she said. "For washing your hands and waiting anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was the easiest thing I ever did." "You were worth every day of it." She looked at him steadily with those dark eyes that still, after 2 years of marriage, had the ability to make him feel entirely known and entirely at ease with being known. "I was not easy," she said. "No," he agreed, "but nothing worth having is." She almost smiled at that, the particular almost smile that was its own form of expression in Henrietta. "Go tell Mrs. Henley and Dorothy," she said. "They are probably wearing holes in the floor out there." He stood and kissed her forehead, which was something she had, after a while, stopped objecting to as unnecessary, and bent to look once more at Thomas Sullivan, who had quieted entirely now, and was sleeping with the utter abandon of someone who has decided the world is acceptable after all. He went out into the hallway where Mrs. Henley and Dorothy were both standing with the barely contained excitement of women who have been waiting very patiently, and he said, "A boy, Thomas. Mother and child are both well," and Dorothy made a sound that was essentially a happy cry, and Mrs. Henley said, "Good, good," in her gruff way, and then produced a handkerchief from her pocket with suspicious speed. Caldwell in the early 1880s was a town in transition. The long drive from Texas, which had been the lifeblood of the cattle trade for over a decade, was beginning to shift its roots as homesteaders moved in, and barbed wire began to divide the open range. The great cattle boom that had made towns like Caldwell and Abilene and Dodge City was not finished yet, but it was changing its character, and the men who wanted to prosper needed to adapt to what was coming rather than hold on to what was going. Albert saw this clearly. He expanded the livery stable in 1881 to include a basic farrier service, hiring a young man of 20 named Isaac Durant who turned out to have a gift for the work. He added a small freight hauling operation in 1882, using 2 sturdy draft horses he bought at a fair price from a farm that was failing, running goods from the rail depot to the businesses in town. It was good, steady work that kept the operation profitable even as the pure cattle trade began to slow. Henrietta, who had left the drovers' rest entirely by 1881, turned her considerable organizational intelligence toward the household, and then beyond it. She took on the bookkeeping for the livery stable and the freight operation with an efficiency that Albert could only admire. She also, in 1882, began teaching reading to the children of several families on the edge of town who could not afford the schoolhouse fee, an informal arrangement that she conducted with the same serious thoroughness she brought to everything. They were prospering. Not in the flashy way of land speculators or cattle barons, but in the solid, sustainable way of people who work honestly and spend carefully and build things meant to last. Their small house was enlarged by 2 rooms in 1882, and the kitchen garden was expanded into a proper vegetable plot that Henrietta tended with the same disciplined attention she gave to the account books. Thomas grew. He was a sturdy, curious child who walked at 11 months and talked at 13, and whose first complete sentence was reportedly, "Pilgrim, no," delivered with enormous authority to the dog who was in the process of eating Thomas's biscuit, which everyone agreed was quite a good first sentence under the circumstances. In the summer of 1882, Henrietta told Albert she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening, on the porch, in the same chairs they had sat in when they were only beginning to find their way toward each other. And the difference between that conversation and this one, the ease and warmth and completeness of it, was not lost on either of them. The second child, born in February of 1883, was a girl. She arrived more quietly than Thomas had, coming into the world on a still winter morning with less drama and more efficiency, which Henrietta said afterward she appreciated very much. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, but because the name suited her clear and bright, which was exactly what she seemed to be from the start. Thomas regarded his sister with the profound suspicion of a 2-year-old who has been the center of things and is now being asked to share. But within several weeks, he had arrived at a position of proprietorial affection that would come to characterize his relationship with her for the rest of his life. He was the brother who would fight her battles and be exasperated by her in equal measure, and Clara was the sister who would tolerate his protection up to a point, and beyond that point had no hesitation about speaking plainly. They were, in other words, very much like their parents. Caldwell continued to evolve. By 1883, the cattle trade through town was diminishing, as the Kisham Trail's dominance weakened, and the Kansas legislature moved to restrict open-range drives. but Albert had diversified well enough that the livery and freight business was independent of the cattle market's fluctuations. He had also, by this point, developed something of a reputation in town as a man who could be relied upon, not in the dramatic way of the gunfighters and lawmen whose stories filled the dime novels, but in the practical, daily way that actually built communities. He was asked, in the fall of 1883, if he would serve on the town council. He brought the question home to Henrietta, who heard it out and then said, with characteristic directness, "It is a reasonable use of your abilities and your standing in this town. You should accept." "You think I should go into public life," he said. "I think you are already in public life," she said. "Half the commerce in this town passes through your stable or your wagons. The council is simply making it official." He accepted the position. He was not a natural politician. He was too direct for backroom maneuvering and too honest for the kind of accommodations that politics sometimes required. But he was a practical man who understood how things worked, and his presence on the council was, by most accounts, more useful than decorative. In 1884, there was an incident that Albert later thought of as the last test of the man he had decided to become. A group of men came through Caldwell, hard men with horses that had been ridden far and fast and eyes that looked at a town the way a vulture looks at a carcass, calculating its value. They boarded their horses at the livery stable, which gave Albert a close look at them, and what he saw made him take Isaac Duran aside and tell him to keep the stable locked after sundown for the next several nights. He went to the town marshal, a sensible man named Crenshaw who had replaced 3 more colorful predecessors, and told him what he had observed, and together they organized a quiet, effective response that resulted in the group of men leaving town very early the following morning without incident, having encountered a degree of readiness that apparently discouraged their original plans. There was no shooting. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was simply a town that knew what was coming and prepared for it, and men who decided they preferred a less prepared target. Afterward, Crenshaw shook Albert's hand and said, "Well handled." "This is how I prefer to handle things," Albert said, and he meant it completely. He told Henrietta about it that evening, and she listened with her customary focused attention, and when he was finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are a different man than you were when you rode into this town 6 years ago." "Am I?" he said. "Not different in your nature," she said. "In how you use yourself, in what you reach for first." She looked at him steadily. "I am very proud of you, Albert." He was not a man who was easily undone by words, but those particular words, said in that particular voice by that particular woman, undid him considerably. "That means more to me than you know," he said. "I expect it means approximately as much as I intend it to," she said, in the dry, precise way that was so entirely Henrietta that he loved her more for it every time. The years that followed were the years of building, not dramatic, not filled with the kind of events that make for campfire stories, but the richer kind, the kind that make for a life. Thomas started school in 1885 and turned out to have his mother's intelligence and his father's stubbornness in roughly equal measure, which his teacher described as a challenge and which Albert privately considered exactly right. Clara started school 2 years later and immediately decided she was there to learn everything, which she appeared to be doing at remarkable speed. Pilgrim grew old gracefully, becoming eventually an enormous white-muzzled presence who moved slowly and slept often, and had the commanding dignity of the very aged. When he died in the spring of 1885, it was peaceful and gentle, at the foot of the bed where he had been sleeping for 4 years despite every attempt to establish a different arrangement, and Henrietta sat with him for a long time afterward and did not pretend not to grieve. Albert buried him in the garden under the cottonwood, and Thomas made a wooden marker for the grave with the earnest seriousness of a 5-year-old who has been asked to do something that matters, and the whole family stood there in the morning light for a few minutes to say goodbye. "He was a good dog," Thomas said. "He was the best dog," Albert said. Henrietta said nothing, which with Henrietta was not absence of feeling but its fullest expression, and Albert put his arm around her and she leaned against him as she had learned to do over these years, easily and without reserve. There was a puppy by October. Thomas had been campaigning for one since May with an effectiveness that reflected well on his future career in whatever argument-dependent profession he ultimately chose. The puppy was a shepherd mix with enormous ears and boundless confidence, and Clara named him Admiral, which suited him entirely. The freight operation expanded in 1886, when the railroad brought new commercial activity through Caldwell, and Albert contracted with 3 merchants for regular goods transport. He hired 2 more drivers and a second farrier, and the business that had begun as a single livery stable was becoming something considerably more substantial. Henrietta managed the books for all of it with the composure of someone who genuinely enjoys the order of numbers, which she did. They were, by this time, comfortable in the true sense of the word, not wealthy by the standard of the great cattle ranchers or the railroad men, but secure, the house larger now, the larder well stocked, the children thriving, the horses good. And they were happy. Not in the breathless way of the first discoveries of love, though that early wonder had not entirely passed, but in the deeper way of 2 people who have lived honestly alongside each other through enough seasons to know each other's rhythms and trust each other's judgment, and find in daily company a satisfaction that could not be manufactured or performed. They disagreed regularly, which was also part of the satisfaction. Neither of them was the kind to agree for peace's sake, and the arguments were genuine exchanges between people who respected each other's intelligence, and they were always, in the end, productive. One evening in October of 1886, when Thomas was 5 and Clara was 3, and the harvest was in, and the freight contracts renewed, and the business settled for the winter, Albert came home from the stable to find Henrietta in the kitchen reading a letter that had arrived in the afternoon post. She looked up when he came in, and her expression was thoughtful in the particular concentrated way that meant she was deciding how to present something. "From Dorothy," she said. "She and George are moving to Oregon Territory. George has been offered a teaching position in Portland." "That is good for them," Albert said, sitting down and pulling off his boots. "Is it sad for you?" Henrietta considered this honestly, the way she considered everything. "It is a little sad," she said. "Dorothy has been my best friend in this town for 8 years. I will miss her very much." She folded the letter. "But she is happy, and George is a good man, and they have an opportunity. One cannot be sad for someone else's good fortune." "You can be a little sad," he said. "A little," she agreed, and gave him one of the small, genuine smiles that were the best of his daily rewards. "You are always very reasonable about feelings." "I learned from you," he said. She looked at him with that warm, direct look that he had first seen across a hotel dining room in 1878, and that still had the power to stop his breath slightly. "That is very unlikely," she said. "I am not particularly reasonable about the feelings that matter most." "Which ones?" he asked. "The ones I have for you," she said simply. "I am completely unreasonable about those. I have been since approximately the 2nd week of knowing you, which I considered deeply inconvenient at the time, and have come to regard as the best thing that ever happened to me." He sat across the kitchen table from his wife in the lamplight, with the sound of their children asleep upstairs and the autumn dark outside the window, and he felt the completeness of his life with a clarity that was almost overwhelming. "Henrietta," he said. "What?" "I love you," he said. Not because it was new information or because the moment required it, but because it was simply true and she was simply there, and it seemed important to keep saying it. "I know you do," she said. "I love you too. Now wash up for supper." He laughed and got up to wash his hands at the basin by the door, and she turned back to the stove, and it was an entirely ordinary evening in the life of 2 people who had found exactly what they were looking for. They wrote to Dorothy and George in Oregon. Dorothy wrote back with descriptions of the coast and the green country so different from the Kansas plain, and Henrietta read the letters at the kitchen table and smiled at them, and filed them carefully in the box where she kept correspondence she valued. And Albert watched her do this and thought again, as he had thought many times over these years, that he had been given something he had not entirely deserved, but had worked very hard to become worthy of. In the spring of 1887, Henrietta told him she was expecting a third child, with the same composed directness she had brought to the previous two announcements, but this time he was ready and he simply took her hands in his and said, "Are you well? Are you happy?" And she said yes to both. The third child came in November of 1887, another boy, born on a cold, clear night with a sky full of stars. They named him James. He was smaller than Thomas had been at birth, but equally loud, which Thomas found interesting from the objective standpoint of a 6-year-old, and Clara found somewhat trying. 3 children in a house of moderate size on a busy street in a cattle town that was slowly becoming something different, a farming community, a trade hub, a settled place rather than a wild crossing point. Caldwell was changing, as all the cattle towns were changing in those years, and Albert watched the change with the attention of a man who had seen the town's most dramatic era and knew that what was coming was different but not lesser. The wild years had their romance in the telling, but they had their cost in the living, and what was coming, the farms, the churches, the schools, the solid permanence of established lives was better, even if it was less dramatic. Albert Sullivan, who had once been the kind of man who lived on the frontier between order and violence, found that he was entirely and genuinely glad to be on the side of order. It was not less interesting than the other life, a freight operation with 3 drivers and a rotating roster of merchant clients and 2 children in school, and 1 in arms had more than enough going on to keep a man engaged. It was simply better. The horses were still there, and the open land was still there when he wanted it, and the work was honest and the sleep was clean. Thomas and Clara grew through those years with the particular speed that makes parents feel that time is both standing still and running away. Thomas at 7 was serious and determined, already showing the focused practicality that would come to define him. Clara at 5 was sharp and curious, and had the absolute conviction of someone who intends to understand everything, which her teacher appeared to find both delightful and occasionally exhausting. James at 2 was an absolute force of nature, who had not yet encountered an obstacle that slowed him down for more than a moment, which his siblings regarded with the weary admiration of people who are older and should, by rights, be more energetic. The freight business continued to grow. Albert brought on a partner in 1889, a capable man named Solomon Reed, who had been working as an independent driver and had the organizational sense to complement Albert's operational expertise. Together they expanded the routes to 3 neighboring towns, and the Sullivan and Reed Freight Company became a fixture of the region's commerce. Henrietta, who had been running the books for the operation since its beginning, took on a more formal role as the business partner handling all financial management, which was simply acknowledging what had always been true. She was better at it than either Albert or Solomon would ever be, and they all knew it, and the arrangement worked very well. The children did not lack for anything important. They had parents who were present and attentive, who argued with each other over the dinner table in a way that was robust but never frightening, who were honest with them about the nature of the world in age-appropriate ways, who made it clear every day in small habitual ways that this household was solid and safe. Albert told Thomas, when the boy was 9, about his years as a deputy marshal. Not everything, not the details that belonged to adults, but the shape of it, and particularly what had led him away from it. Thomas listened with the intense focus he gave to things he considered important, and then said, with the directness that was his mother's most recognizable gift to him, "Was it hard to change?" "Yes," Albert said, "but less hard than I expected once I had decided to." "Why did you decide to?" Thomas asked. Albert thought about this for a moment. Because someone I loved showed me that who I was choosing to be mattered more than the reputation I had built, he said. And because I wanted to be the man she was showing me I could be. Thomas considered this with his brow furrowed, processing. Then he said, "Is that why you always wash your hands before supper?" Albert blinked and then laughed, a full, genuine laugh that brought Henrietta in from the next room to see what was happening. "What?" she said, looking between them. "Your son," Albert said, "has arrived at a piece of wisdom by an unusual route." Henrietta looked at Thomas. "What wisdom?" Thomas looked slightly uncertain about whether this was a good development. "I just asked why he decided to stop being a marshal," he said carefully. "And he said washing his hands matters." Henrietta looked at Albert over their son's head, and in her eyes was something that was entirely understanding and entirely warm and entirely between the two of them. "He is right about that," she said, and ruffled Thomas's hair in the rare demonstrative gesture she gave when she could not quite contain affection. "Go finish your supper." Thomas went. Henrietta stayed in the doorway for a moment. "You told him," she said quietly. "The general shape of it," Albert said. "He asked directly. He deserved a direct answer." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the expression he had come to know as her rarest one, fully open, fully present, without any reserve at all. "You are a good father," she said. "I had motivation," he said. "Albert," she said, with the tone that meant she was about to say something she had thought about carefully. "What?" "I've been thinking about something for a while," she said. She moved fully into the room and sat down across from him, the way they had sat across from each other in the hotel kitchen all those years ago when everything was still new and uncertain. "About the thing I said when we were on the porch, the 1st September. About not loving a man with blood on his hands," he said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "I said it was about you, but it was about me, about my fear. I know I acknowledged that before. But I have been thinking about the fuller truth of it, which is that I was wrong to put it on you as a condition. You had done nothing to me personally. You were a man who had lived the only way available to him in the world he had been given, and you had already decided on your own to change that world, and I used your past against you as a way to protect myself from being hurt." "Henrietta, let me finish," she said. "I need to say this properly." She took a breath. "You washed your hands not because I made you, but because you chose to. And you waited, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. And you have been, for 11 years now, exactly the man you told me you intended to be. Not perfect, neither of us is that, but honest and good and genuinely trying, every day, to build something worth building." She paused. "I want you to know that I know that I have always known it really, but that I know it better now, after 11 years of watching you live it." Albert Sullivan, 40 years old in the fall of 1891, sitting in the parlor of the house he owned in the town he had settled in because a horse threw a shoe, looked at his wife of 12 years and felt the accumulated weight of everything they had built together as something warm and entire. "You were not wrong to be careful," he said. "You protected yourself the only way you knew how, and what it cost you to be honest about it was considerable. I never blamed you for any of it." "I know you did not," she said. "That is part of what I am trying to tell you." He reached across the small table and took her hand, as he had done in the kitchen of the Drovers' Rest more than a decade ago, the same gesture, the same rightness of it. "Henrietta," he said, "you said you could not love a man with blood on his hands, and I washed my hands and I waited. And then you loved me anyway, and you have been loving me every day since, and it has been the great fortune of my life. That is the whole story, and it is a good one, and I would not change a single day of it." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had been the first thing about her he could not look away from, and they were exactly the same as they had been in 1878, direct and warm and full of more than they ever entirely said out loud. "I would not change a day of it either," she said. Their hands stayed interlaced across the small table, while the sounds of the house moved around them. Clara's voice upstairs, the particular thud that suggested James had either fallen off something or jumped from something, Thomas's footsteps on the stairs going to investigate. The dog, Admiral, raised his head from his position by the fire and then lowered it again, apparently satisfied that the household was in order. Outside, Caldwell was settling into its autumn evening, the streets quieting, the businesses closing up, the lamplighter making his rounds just as he had on that September evening in 1878, when a young woman had told a young man the honest, hard truth of what she needed, and he had heard it without flinching. Albert had been 27 then, roughened by trail years, and carrying a weight he had not yet figured out how to put down. He was 40 now, and the weight was gone, not because it had been lifted by force, but because he had set it down deliberately, one day at a time. And what had grown in its place was this: the lamplit house and the sound of his children and the hand of his wife in his, and the quiet, profound satisfaction of a life that had been built exactly as it should have been. Thomas came in from upstairs with the report that James had in fact jumped from the wardrobe onto the bed, which he seemed to consider a matter of neutral fact rather than a judgment. Clara came in behind him with a book she wanted her mother to look at, a natural history of birds that she had borrowed from the school teacher and was extremely invested in. James appeared behind both of them with the expression of someone who has recently completed a successful experiment. Henrietta released Albert's hand and turned her attention to Clara's book with genuine interest, because she was always genuinely interested. Albert took James onto his knee and inquired about the wardrobe jumping with the serious tone of a man conducting a factual inquiry, and Thomas settled on the floor near the fire with the proprietorial calm of the firstborn who considers the household essentially his to oversee. Admiral thumped his tail. The lamplight was warm. Outside, the Kansas evening was cold and clear, the kind of night that showed every star, and the town of Caldwell went on with its ordinary, extraordinary life. They would live in that house for many more years. Thomas would grow into a thoughtful, practical man who eventually took over the Sullivan and Reed Freight Company with Albert's blessing and Solomon Reed's enthusiastic support, running it with his mother's head for numbers and his father's feel for people. Clara would become a teacher, with the same intense curiosity she had always had, eventually teaching in the Caldwell school where she herself had learned, and then later at the new schoolhouse in the expanding town that Caldwell was becoming. James would eventually head north to work with cattle, which was in his blood somehow despite having been born into commerce, and he would return to Caldwell periodically, with the particular energy of a man who loves open country but loves his family more. Albert and Henrietta would watch all of this happen from the porch of a house that grew and changed around them, as houses do when families grow and change within them. They would argue about the freight company's expansion plans and the school board's decisions and the price of feed. They would sit in companionable silence on summer evenings. They would dance occasionally, at weddings and celebrations, with the ease of people who have been dancing together long enough to stop thinking about it. They would grow older together in the best way without apology, with appreciation for what had been given to them, with the humor that comes from having known someone long enough to know all their patterns and love them anyway. In the later years, when Thomas brought home a wife, a sensible, warm woman named Margaret who fit into the family with remarkable ease, and when the first grandchild arrived, a boy, Henrietta and Albert sat on their porch in the evening with the weight of a good life around them and talked about everything and nothing in the way of people who have run out of awkward silences permanently. "Do you remember," Henrietta said one evening, in the way she rarely began conversations, "what you said on the porch?" "That first September, I said several things," Albert said. "You said you had nowhere better to be," she said. "I remember." "Did you mean it?" she asked. Not as a challenge, she knew the answer, but as something she wanted to hear again, the same way you return to a familiar piece of music not because you have forgotten it, but because it is worth hearing again. "I meant it then," Albert said. "I mean it considerably more now." She reached over and took his hand in the gathering dark of a Kansas evening, the kind that had gold at its edges and went on forever, and she held it with the particular grip of someone who has decided to hold on and has been holding on for a very long time and intends to go on doing so. "I know," she said. "So do I." The stars came out over Caldwell, Kansas, one by one, as they always did, as they had been doing since long before there was a town here and would go on doing long after. The house behind them was lit and warm and full of the sounds of a family in its evening. Albert Sullivan and Henrietta Fairchild Sullivan sat on their porch in the full, earned peace of a life they had built together honestly, and the night came on slow and beautiful around them, and it was entirely enough. It was, in fact, everything.